All right, we'll get started. I'm Joe Siclari, and this is the life of Dave Kyle, or those parts of it that we can talk in public about. Dave,
Yes.
you've been in fandom for nearly 80 years now.
Oh my gosh.
Do you think we can cover it in 60 minutes?
Well, we can try.
Okay, we will. Let me just start with a couple of facts. You started in fandom around 1933, 34,
About then.
and you went to the first Worldcon. Actually, you went to the first convention in the U.S.
Yeah, that's right.
And
I was in Philadelphia, of all places.
right, and for the first Worldcon, you actually were the first troublemaker. And
So what's
some
new?
people, yeah, that's right. Some people claim that you're the grandfather of comics fandom, and you were a publisher, a science fiction historian, an editor, a writer, and even a Worldcon chair,
An illustrator.
and an illustrator. That's right. I didn't put that down. We were going to get to that a little bit later, but
Okay.
so we have lots to talk about. And well, let's start right at the beginning. How
That
did
far
you
back?
that far back? So stretch your memory. How getting into
Well,
fandom? How did you actually discover us?
That isn't where. That's not the beginning.
Okay, where's the beginning?
The beginning is the American Boy magazine, around the late 20s, when American Boy magazine was publishing science fiction,
Right.
which I didn't know was science fiction. All I knew was it was very interesting, imaginative fiction.
Right.
And the author became well known, but not necessarily in the science fiction field, called Carl H. Claudy.
Carl H. Claudy. Okay.
Carl H. Claudy. And Carl H. Claudy, who was a Mason, by the way, I knew him as such in a museum that I researched.
Okay.
Published in American Boy magazine some of the first science fiction that I ever read, but it was not called science fiction.
What was it called?
I don't know, imaginative literature or something like that.
All right. So this is even before Gernsback.
Sort of. It's about the time that Gernsback was starting his science fiction magazines.
Okay.
And the first science fiction magazine, actual science fiction magazines, that I encountered, and which led me into the field, had on the cover a cylinder, a green cylinder, heading down into the open sea. And if anybody will remember it, it's because it's been used as an illustration on the Reader Speaks in Wonder Stories magazine for many years.
Oh.
Because it was what that was as the head of the Reader Speaks in the magazines, was a reproduction, a form of reproduction of that first science fiction magazine that I ever read. And I don't know what the year would have been, but probably around, 28, 29?
All right. So 28, 29. How old were you?
Just going into my teenage, I guess.
Okay. You know, you started reading, so the reading of science fiction, and then when did you actually start thinking about fandom or get to know that there was a fandom out there?
Really, the beginning of all fandom can be attributed to Hugh Gernsback because in his magazines he used to publish letters in the back of the magazines.
Right.
And not only did he publish letters with the names of the person who sent it in, but also addresses. And it was really a foundation of fandom, because here you had names of fans
Right.
and addresses that you could actually correspond with. And that's how a lot of this correspondence started, with picking up the names and addresses in the backs of Gernsback magazines.
So he would actually put the street address. Can't do
Yes.
that these days.
No.
Who was the first fan that you actually corresponded with?
Forrest J. Ackerman,
Was it?
yes.
All right.
Now, why did that happen? It was because in those days, back in the early 30s, there were letters published in magazines. And I had a letter published, and there was another person who had lots of letters published over the years. His name was Forrest J. Ackerman.
Right.
So I wrote a letter to the magazine, which he published, and I said at the end of close of my letter, after I told him how great the magazine was and how many flaws they had in it, as juveniles always did in those days, criticize the editor. I had a letter published in the magazine, and I think it was Forrest Ackerman, the one who first made contact with me.
Okay, so he got in touch with you.
Yes, and in a very distinguished way. He wrote in green ink.
Did that for a long time.
And when that inspired me, henceforth, after I got his first correspondence from him, I used to write letters in purple ink. The use of the color purple I use as a identifying name in a science fiction magazine, and the back pages where the readers had letters published. And I had a letter published called The Purple Bat. Now, Robert A. Madel, one of the very early science fiction fans who was here this weekend, this is being his home ground, Philadelphia, actually addressed me this weekend as the Purple Bat.
Right.
Because I had a letter published in the magazine. Not only did I have a letter under my name, but there was also a letter under the name of the Purple Bat. I did not realize until I was told today that what I thought was anonymous wasn't because, although it said Purple Bat, it also had my hometown, which was a small town, Monticello, New York.
Yes. Speaking of being anonymous, the general organized parts of fandom sprung out of Wonder Stories magazine when Charles Horning, the editor, the young editor at that point, actually a fan, convinced Gernsback to do the Science Fiction League. Now, rumor has it that you joined as an early member of the Science Fiction League under what may be questionable circumstances, that they required 3 people to get together to have a chapter. And as you said, Monticello was a very small town. Who were the other 2 people who joined your chapter?
First, I have to say that Frederick Pohl was responsible for the rumor that the Science Fiction League chapter of Monticello, New York, was my invention with a lot of fictitious names.
Okay.
Now, it was my invention, chapter 5, I think it was, of the science fiction.
Very early one, I remember reading.
That was not true. I really had live bodies because when I was going to high school, I got a few people that were not science fiction fans to say, I want you to join a club that I'm starting called Science Fiction League, chapter, or whatever it was, chapter 5. And so I actually had live bodies, but they weren't science fiction fans.
Okay, so he indicated it was a half-truth then.
It was a half-truth, yes.
So, what did the Science Fiction League in Monticello, New York do?
Mostly, the league itself wrote letters under my name to the magazines.
I thought there might be something like that.
Right.
Then later on, you moved to New York. Actually, not all that much later.
Well, when I came out of high school, I had expected to go to Dartmouth College, but it was in the days of the Depression.
Right.
And I didn't have the money, but I had a little money, and my folks had a little money, and I went to art school. And that's how I became an illustrator.
Right.
In 1936, going to the art school at the Flatiron Building in New York.
Oh, okay.
And and that's what led to my early science fiction illustrating from having gone to art school.
And at that point, you were getting involved with the various clubs that were in New
Well,
York.
of course, what happened was that I was in a small town, Monticello, New York, and the only people I knew was through correspondence.
Right.
But when I came to New York, this was a hotbed of science fiction fandom at the time.
Sure was.
And so I immediately made contact with Richard Wilson.
Okay.
And Dick Wilson knew other science fiction fans like Dirk Wiley and later Don Walheim and so forth. So when I came out of high school, though I had not had any personal contact with any actual fans, when I came to New York City, there were a whole number of fans, like a dozen that are around. And there was a meeting of a club called ISA Now, the ISA was International Scientific Association.
Yes.
But what happened was that the International Scientific Association attracted what fans there were in the area, meaning Don Walheim and Johnny Michel and so forth, who came in under the ISA banner, International Scientific Association, and proceeded over the course of a year or so to turn the scientific organization into a fanish organization. Now, it only took a few fans, a handful of fans, to make a club identified with science fiction. But it met in the house of a fellow by the name of William S. Sikora. And William S. Sikora was more interested in science than he was in science fiction. But his place was a meeting place, and that meeting place, like a magnet drawing, those attracted to that particular situation met and turned what was should have been a science-oriented group into a science fiction-oriented group. And that ISA became the basis of the Science Fiction League chapter and a whole development of fandom in New York City. So I happened to be there at the very first time that this was coalescing. The first time that elder fans, Fred Pohl, for example, was half a year younger than me, was one of the original people.
This was about 1936,
1936, yes.
36. So, since you got involved with them, were you also one of the group that came down to Philadelphia?
Yes,
And
yeah, that's right.
First convention in the United States.
First convention, well, we thought the first convention in the world, but it was disputed by some people in Britain.
That's true.
Which was logical because they actually planned one ahead of time. Some British fans
Right.
in 36 had put out some information that they were going to hold it, I think, in January. But when we met a few months earlier in Philadelphia, we called ourselves the first science fiction convention, although the one in England had actually advertised itself as that, as such.
I just actually read a 1937 fanzine from Chicago that talks about the Leeds convention.
Oh,
the fact
really?
that they had actually had it
Yes.
as the first convention, which I'll have to show you. The people, as you were meeting them, Sikora, Walheim, Pohl, were they what you were expecting from science fiction fans, having listened or read their letters and
I had
things
no
like that?
expectations at all.
No.
All I knew was that we had something in common, and I had a way of being contacted with people like that, and I just sort of melted into the community. It was the most natural thing to do.
Well, the discussion that you guys were having during the early period, that ended up becoming the formation of what became one of the most well-known groups of fans, the Futurians.
Right.
How did that particular group actually get started? Was it from the split with the ISA?
Well, the ISA being the Independent League for Science Fiction, which was fragmented from the Science Fiction League that
Right.
Gernsback had started. I never went to the Queen's SFL meetings because there were more interesting activities among the people that I had just met.
Okay,
Also juveniles, like Fred Pohl, for example.
right.
And so there was no need for me to go to the Queen's SFL because I already had my interests with friendships in Manhattan.
In Manhattan, okay.
And I lived in the YMCA, and to indicate how things were treated in those days, knowing Donald Walheim and me living in the YMCA, I used to get letters addressed to me at the YMCA, 23rd Street YMCA, to David A. Kyle, editor of the American Buddhist.
What was that?
That was just something to make the people who ran the YMCA think, who is it that we're harboring here?
I see.
And so it was. I never had to explain it, but to get a letter addressed to David A. Kyle, editor of the American Buddhist at the YMCA, I'm glad I never had to explain it.
But it raised your prestige. At least you thought so.
Yeah, whatever it was, whatever it raised.
Okay. Well, let's get to the first Worldcon, because we don't need to cover all the details about getting to the first Worldcon.
Right.
And we discussed this at the panel earlier, but I think maybe there were some other people here. Probably your first maybe notorious act.
Notorious is a good word.
In fandom was a little publication that you did.
You mean A Warning?
A Warning,
Yeah.
yes. That's the title of it, A Warning. That's one of the corrections we need to make from the bio.
Right.
But why don't you tell people how that arose and what resulted from it?
Well, I was going to college at the time, and when I came back, I found out that there was a feud going on between two groups in Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
One headed by William S. Siclari, and the other one headed by I suppose, by Donald Walheim.
Was that new fandom at the time, the Siclari?
No, that came later.
That came later, okay.
The new fandom came, yes, later. No, it was just that there was a this was formulated years when nothing had been really organized, and the only basis for any kind of organization happened to be Gernsback's Science Fiction League. George Gordon Clark was #1 in the Science Fiction League. He came from Brooklyn, New York. What happened was that Gernsback published a magazine and said that he was starting a club, or the magazine was starting a club, and that all you had to do was fill out the coupon and send it in.
Okay.
And so I procrastinated, and as a result of procrastination, I was only #5 in the Science Fiction League.
You must have delayed a long, long time then.
Yeah. That Science Fiction League was really the result of Gernsback being interested in promoting science fiction in his magazine, but I think of it as the beginning of fandom itself. And then there were clubs that were developed out of the formalization of the Science Fiction League.
The Warning that you did.
Yes.
Now, that was a publication you did after you came back.
Right.
And based on the potential feud, or the feud that was going on between the Moskowitz-Sikora group and the Futurians.
Right.
Now, from what you told me earlier today, you went to the convention having had prepared this in case there was a problem, and sort of stashed these publications off behind a radiator or something like that.
There was efforts under the way to create a convention.
Mm-hmm.
Having stepped back into this turmoil of two groups fighting each other, I was on the side that was represented by Walheim, and not on the side of the Sikora side. So, and when I got active again, coming back from college in late May, beginning of June, I took up my stance with what would be called the Walheim side.
Right.
But I recognized that this was a serious feud that was going on, that it was developing while I was away at university. I got to preface this here. We were all juveniles, really. This is all kid stuff, really. Mm-hmm. We're all in the teenage or early 20s. And the oldest one in the group, I guess, was Don Walheim, and I think he's 22 at the time or something like that. So knowing that there was a conflict, one side bidding with the other side to establish a convention, and coming back as this feud was going on, and being somebody whose family was in the newspaper business, in the printing business, I printed up a pamphlet and said, in effect, be careful, because the next meeting, one of these groups, I didn't phrase it that way, but what was implicit in what I had to say was, somebody's going to try to take over and run this and let it be a democratic thing. So I published this little pamphlet which said something about democracy. I don't know what it was. And now you've got to think at this time, there was a great deal of political activity in the world. It was fascism,
Right.
communism, a war was brewing, and so it was natural for me, seeing that science fiction fans at that time were very interested in the future, tended to support one side or the other, and so the side that I supported was the side that represented democracy. And what was that side? That was the side that fought in the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War, prior to World War II, had a real conflict between two ideologies, fascism on one side and communism on the other. And in the Spanish Civil War, the fascists under Franco was succeeding, and eventually took Madrid and so forth. But I identified with what would be called the more democratic side, rather than the fascist side.
Which was, by many people at the time, considered more communistic.
That's right, because there were actually two divisions of politics that time. There were fascists and the communists.
Okay.
And the Spanish Civil War was the testing ground of fascism against communism.
So your publication ended up having a number of well-known fans at the time, not allowed into the Worldcon. People like Walheim, John Mitchell at the time, and a few others. Michelle, okay. But you mentioned the war. You know, a lot of people know about the Futurians in the first, but I guess the question would be, as they used to ask, what did you do in the war, Daddy?
Yeah. I read the newspapers, I know that.
Yeah?
But I was too young for any kind of active participation. I was in the ROTC at the University of Alabama, which I first went to, although I'm a Columbia University graduate, but I started my university career in Alabama, and that was just as the things were hotting up in Europe. With the Spanish Revolution and so forth. So we've got to remember that young fans, as we were teenagers for the most part, were idealistic, and the idealism of communism, so appealing, resulted in most fans being oriented towards communism, not fascism. Fascism was not very popular. So if you look at the time that I was becoming active in fandom, it was only natural that I should be in what I would be termed the democratic side, rather than the fascist side.
Well, Milt Rothman told me one of the reasons after he became a physicist, he had problems with the U.S. government because he was associated with people who were communists.
Yes. Well,
he was, he wanted to be on the Manhattan Project.
Oh.
And
well, you see, that's the strange thing about it, that science fiction fans, young fans, teenagers, and around that age group, idealistically minded, would tend to support those philosophies that seemed more democratic. If you were against fascists, you were for communists. And if you were against fascists and for communists, you became a communist.
Okay.
It's as simple as that.
Well, we've gone through half the panel, and we haven't yet gotten past the early 40s. So let's see if we can jump ahead about 10 years to your small publishing career.
Yes.
You and Marty Greenberg, not the Marty Greenberg that has done numerous anthologies in the last 30 years, but would you tell us how you got started and how Gnome Press got organized?
And at the ending of World War II, There was a couple of small presses being created. The most famous, which was Fantasy Press with Lloyd Eschbach, and it was, and because I was in the printing business, in the publishing business, it was one of these things in which Marty Greenberg says, "Dave, I just got a manuscript. You ought to be able to work out a deal to get it published." And that was the beginning. So I published Fletcher Pratt's and Spade Camp's Carnelian Cube, which had not been published. So Carnelian Cube became the first product of what was Gnome Press. Now, where did the name Gnome come from? Now, the name came from the fact that Gnome was the symbol of a resort area that my father had.
Right.
And that symbol was a natural gnome, being treasure keeper and so forth.
Yes.
We used the name Gnome. So that was the beginning of Gnome Press.
In hopes of making your treasure.
Yes, in hopes. But only the first book was published locally by the Advisor Press. That was the shop that my family had. And after the first book came out, I investigated the possibility of getting a professional printer to do it. So we went to a place called Colonial Press that printed books in Massachusetts, and we started publishing books in a legitimate way, that is to say, by professional printers rather than homemade books.
And you used your artistic talents to also design some of the covers.
Yeah, I did everything that had to do with design and editorial comment and so forth was me. Marty was the idea man. It was his original idea to collect some manuscripts and get them published.
Well, you stayed involved with fandom, and a few years later, in New York, you were involved in running your own Worldcon.
Right. So to speak.
So to speak? Okay, well, tell us what you did for the Worldcon.
Fred, Paul, and I came back from a convention in Philadelphia, of all places, which had been left over by 4 years because of the war.
Okay.
It was a continuation, sort of picking up where conventions had been going for a number of years,
Okay.
and then didn't exist for
Again, one of the Philcons.
And so the first Philcon after armistice of World War II, Fred and Paul and I were down here. One of us looked it up, and whatever the information was, wherever we got it, we heard there was this science fiction gathering. So Fred, Paul and I went down to Philadelphia to this gathering, and we had a good time, and said, "Gee, let's do something about this." So on the train back, we organized the Hydra Club.
The Hydra Club.
And it was called Hydra Club because I think we had 9 members to begin with, and Hydra has 9 heads, I think. Is that right? So the Hydra Club became the focus of science fiction fanish activities in a more mature way, not like the Queen Science Fiction League and so forth, but a little more professional. And out of the Hydra Club came a lot of professional work. And we had editor of the Book of the Month Club was a member of the Hydra Club, for example, Basil Davenport.
Really?
And so we were in an enviable position of being at the end of World War II and the beginning of the peace era to see the interest growing in science fiction all of a sudden.
Right.
And it was in a matter of a few years that science fiction became very, very popular.
Right. The small presses were going on. There was an increase in the magazines.
And can you know how many magazines are on the stand at one time?
Now, how many?
I think it was something like 50.
Wow, that is quite a bit.
That's
Must have
because
been
some
one
of the
of the peaks.
magazines were printed with no dates on them, so magazines could last a long time on the newsstand. See?
Guess
For
so, until
sales.
they sold out.
Until yes. So So at the beginning of the new peace era after World War II, and the formation of the gathering together of professionals, some who had still hadn't been involved in the war, like Fletcher Pratt,
Right.
and the newer ones, like myself and Fred Pohl, were members of this new organization called the Hydra Club. It was really a social club that encompassed professionals at the time.
So the group of you decided that a Worldcon in New York was a good idea and proposed it at the convention before?
It was a natural outgrowth. I don't think that was the original intent, but it was something that naturally developed when we found out that there was interest and that we were in more respectable situations now. We were now adults and not juveniles having gone to
Right.
war. And Fred became active as a professional in editing with popular publications.
Sure did. Well, when you got along, let's stay in the mid-50s. You met a lady at that point who later became your wife.
Right.
Where did you meet Ruth?
Ruth was a genuine science fiction enthusiast who had no connection with any club or anything. She read the magazines, she read in Astounding Stories, and Campbell was very good about that. I noticed there was going to be a convention in Cleveland, I believe.
Okay.
And she said, that's an opportunity to go. And as I love science fiction and I know about a lot of these authors, I think I will go there and maybe meet some of these authors and so forth. So on her own, not connected in any way with a science fiction group or club, she went to Cleveland.
The convention.
And came into the convention. It was small, very small convention. Everybody knew everybody. I remember seeing her for the first time. She came in, and I did my usual thing when I saw somebody that I hadn't known before. I would say, have you been to a convention before? No. Do you know anybody here? No. Well, how would you like to meet? And then I'd pick out a couple of distinguished names. And
some name dropping, huh?
Yeah, so
I remember seeing pictures of Ruth from that period. I would have thought that you would have had an awful lot of competition.
Yeah, I would have thought that too. Now, for some reason or other, I was attracted to the idea of introducing her to these distinguished people.
For some idea.
Yeah.
For some reason.
Yeah, well, whatever it was, it didn't work out the first evening because the next thing you know, we had met and I thought we were going to have a chance to talk that evening. Small hotel, small convention, and she didn't show up. And when I looked around, I found her between Robert Bloch and Isaac Asimov. And so that was it. I stuck my head in and saw what was going on, and I left. And the next day, which I think was Sunday, I met Ruth, and she said, "Where were you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, last time we were talking, we were in the hallway of the small hotel, and you said, 'Excuse me, Ruth, there's somebody just came in the door and I want to say hello to, and I'll be right back.' And I said, 'Yeah, when I came back, you weren't there.' She said, 'Well, that was because this person rushed up to me, grabbed me by the shoulders, by the arms, and said, "Come on, you're going to come to a party." And she said, "No, I can't." And he said, "Why not?" She said, "I'm waiting for Dave Kyle." And he said, "Oh, Dave Kyle will be there." And he pushed her into the elevator.
That sounds like a man with the name of Asimov.
That's right. That was Isaac Asimov.
You left her in the hands of Isaac Asimov.
I didn't leave her. She left me.
Oh.
See? So that evening when I saw her with Robert Bloch and Isaac Asimov, I figured, well, she's not interested in me, so I went to whatever else. So I wasn't in her vicinity. The next day, She said, "Where were you last night?" And I said, "Well," I said, "I might ask the same question. You were with," and I mentioned, and oh yes, she said, "But they said that you would join us." You know, one of these
Asimov
lies.
was always good with words.
One of these lies, you know. And I said, "Well, what happened?" She said, "Well, I talked with Isaac Asimov for about an hour or someplace, having coffee or something." I said, "Oh, well." And so it was even fortunate that the following morning that we met. Wasn't it fortunate? Very fortunate because we eventually got married, so it was fortunate that morning.
Yes,
that
it
we met,
was.
wasn't it?
And shortly thereafter,
Yeah,
you ran a
shortly.
Worldcon, and then you organized a honeymoon trip.
Yes.
And you took her all the way over to London.
Yes. Well, what's so interesting? So I was with Ruth that weekend, and
Oh,
and
go
then
back.
on a Sunday, I said, "Can we?" That's when we had banquets. I said, "Would you sit at the banquet table with me?" And she said, "Yes." And when it came time for the banquet, I found out that I couldn't sit with her because I had to be at the head table. So I had to apologize to her. "I'm sorry, but you know, you'll be with friends, but I have to be at the head table." So, but for some, I like to say that for some unknown reason, but I know what the reason was. It turned out that Ruth, who was working in Princeton, New Jersey, suddenly got a job in New York City. And
Really?
suddenly we started attending some of these science fiction clubs that I had established. Well, I knew she was a science fiction fan, but I think it was more than that that attracted her to some of these club meetings. And the next thing you know, within a year, she was secretary of the Worldcon that I had created from the year before. And as chairman of the World Convention, and as by some marvelous fluke of nature, she had moved to New York City. I said, "Would you serve on the committee?" "Oh, yes." "Would you be the secretary?" "Oh, yes." So she became secretary of the Worldcon. And from that led to me chartering an airplane for a honeymoon to take her to England with 50 some odd other science fiction people.
Not too many people take 50 other people on their honeymoon.
No, that's it. Especially when the plane could only hold 50 some odd people. So it was a full airplane.
Well, that was good. There were some controversies with that, but let's.
Well, I know what the controversy was, and I wouldn't mind talking about it.
Well, if you
It
like.
was- I was living, I had gone to Potsdam, New York to establish a radio station.
Yes.
And now having made a friendship with Ruth, I said, "Will you be, I'll stay in contact with you and you can go to meetings and tell me what's going on and so forth." And it turned out there was a woman who wanted to head everything, and in my absence, saying, "Well, I'll do this for David and I'll do that for David," whereas it was really Ruth that wanted her to do it. And that led to a minor feud for a moment. And these people, when that tried to take over the chartering of an airplane, which I arranged for, it progressed to the point where the people that were going to help me took over. They were going to sign all the contracts and everything that I had already signed and so
Right.
forth. So there a feud developed there between the people that wanted to take over, and mostly a woman, and me in my absence. But Ruth stayed loyal and followed my instructions, and the chartered airplane to England went through all right. But it worked out well. Chartered the whole airplane, and it was just filled with science fiction people. And in the days when aircraft transatlantic were small
Sure were.
in number.
It was quite an unusual feat. Now, when you went over to London, later in your life, you actually moved to London. Did you meet a lot of fans there that became lifetime fans?
Oh, yes.
Friends?
I had gone to England a couple of times previously after I came out of the wars, and transatlantic fares were cheap. And I made my connections and supported Ted Carnell's English editor bid for London. I supported the London, And I said, in the voting that year, it used to be voted for the next year for the convention.
Right.
And the convention in New York, I said, if you'll vote it outside of the country and send the convention to London, I'll charter an airplane or I'll do something and we'll get a lot of fans to go. And so that helped, I guess. And Ted Carnell was there too. So London was voted as the next convention site. And yes, I filled up an airplane and sent an airplane load of American fans to England.
Well, sometime after that, you had you and Ruth had a son, and you named him after another writer.
Yeah, my son is Arthur C. Kyle, and I told Arthur Clarke that it was partly in his honor that it was Arthur C. But actually, my father's name was Arthur C. too.
So you had you finagled a little bit there.
Well, why not pass the credit around? You know?
Honor multiple people.
See, so yes. In fact, it worked out very well because years later, when my son was, I don't know, 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever, Arthur Clarke, when I lived in England for a while, would take my son around by a hand through the movie studios when they were making a movie.
Okay.
And he'd introduce my son, who was, I don't know, 6, 7, about, as this is the other Arthur C. Arthur C. Clarke, would introduce my little boy as the other Arthur C. Clarke, that's quite a distinct.
No, that's definitely unusual, since he was not.
But
didn't have any
But we
offspring.
were able to wander the set when they were making 2001. You know.
Okay. All right. Well, there's so much more we can cover, but we've only got a couple of minutes left. So, you had. Let's talk about a little bit about your writing career, your professional career. You have you had a number of stories published.
Well, a terrible thing happened.
Okay, tell me.
In writing. When I was a teenager, I wrote a story, and it was accepted, and called Golden Nemesis, and I said, "Boy, this is easy, you know. I write a story and get accepted right away." It was the only story I sold for about 6 years after that one.
Well, unfortunately, we're not going to cover any more because our time is out.
Right.
But thank you all for attending. Dave, thank you for being so active in the field for 80 years.